Welcome everyone! Welcome to this advanced course on the manual control of your camera. In this course, we'll be discovering more options of the camera menu, which are more complex, but will help you improve the quality of your photos, as well as to get to know which other options your camera offers. If you're already familiar with the manual mode, then you must understand which the basic parameters are: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So you know these three parameters determine the amount of light, and the importance we give to each of them will depend on the result we want to get. What about these parameters when working with the manual mode? Well, when working with the manual mode, we'll find the exposure meta, which determines the proper exposure for a photograph. So, when working with the manual mode, the exposure meta is constantly moving and changing. Why does this happen? Well, when we take a photo, we orientate our camera to a particular point. So, depending on the amount of light of that area or point, the exposure value will be different. So, it's not the same to shoot a white wall than a dark object. For example, so at the end of the day, we need to take a photo with a proper exposure. It is a proper amount of light. So, as I was saying, we can work with the manual mode, and in this case, it is us who set the parameters. And also, the exposure meter is continuously changing and indicating if we are working with a proper amount of light or not. From now on, guys, pay attention to the control wheel, this dial, where we can see different letters, right? These letters indicate a variety of purposes when exposing our photos. For example, we can find AV, TV mode, or A mode, which can be found in some cameras, or S, and also P. And each of them prioritizes a specific parameter. For example, AV mode, which is great for working, and which I really like, gives priority to the aperture. In other cameras, this mode is indicated simply with an A, okay? Guys, what does it mean, aperture priority? That with a semi-automatic exposure mode, the exposure meters always stays at 0. Remember that with the manual mode, it's moving constantly. So when it's fixed at 0, we are prioritizing one parameter, in this case, the aperture. As I said, AV or A are related to the aperture. So when taking a picture, we'll be giving priority to the depth of field. It is the blur we get. Let's say I want to take a close-up of a flower with a blurred background. Then we'd use an open aperture, and the camera subordinates the speed to the aperture. So we don't have to think about the second parameter. It would be different with the manual mode, where we would have to set the aperture and the exposure meta would move constantly. So guys, try this mode with your cameras, okay, to see how it works. In which case would we use AV mode? When we want to give priority to the depth of field. Remember, we'd use a wide open aperture if we want more blur, and small aperture if we want a sharp scene. Other options are the TV mode, or S, which gives priority to the shutter speed. It is to the exposure time. This mode is completely opposite to the previous one. When it comes to shutter speed, we set the speed, and it's especially used for capturing scene with movement, like a football match, someone else running or jumping. So if we work with a faster speed, like 1/500, our camera tries to use an aperture that works fine with that speed. These are quite faster modes and easier to control, particularly with the scenes with light variation, and in those cases where the manual mode perhaps is more difficult to use, since these are faster seen and we don't have enough time to adjust the parameters. Then here we find the P mode, program mode. In general, this works fine for any scene. It's quite similar to the manual mode, but with control. If we select the automatic mode, which is the green icon you can see on your control dial in your camera, you'll realize that some controls don't appear anymore, like the metering mode white balance, picture style, and so on. There's almost nothing to be adjusted. However, with the P mode, the program mode, we can adjust certain parameters which will be seen throughout the course. Why? Because it's an auto mode, but with certain controls. Okay, guys. All semi-automatic modes work under the Reprocessing Rule. I know it may sound complex, but it's not. When shooting a particular scene, indoors or outdoors, reciprocity in photography refers to the relationship between the shutter speed and the aperture, and sometimes the ISO, to adjust the exposure so that it works for the scene. I can work with a wide-open aperture and a faster shutter speed, or I can work with a small aperture and slower speed. So it's connected to the amount of light we are letting through into the lens. For this reason, this Reprocessing Rule, which is the one used by these semi-automatic modes, eases the task of adjusting the exposure. Another thing to bear in mind when working with semi-automatic modes is that we may get some notification on the screen indicating if we are using the proper parameters or not. Let's say there's poor light and we want to work with a faster speed, then will be indicated by a notification which, depending on your camera, can be a red number or a blinking. So it warns you that you need to change the parameters because those you're using aren't suitable for the light of the scene. So you need either to change the parameters or to add light to the scene. We'll be seeing this later on, okay? And there's more. As you know, your camera has these three main parameters: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Regarding ISO, there's something quite interesting. Within the ISO settings, your camera allows you to select an automatic mode, which is great since it will ease the task a lot. So we can select the auto option for the ISO, which means that the parameters will change automatically depending on the light of the scene, especially with sudden light variation. Let's say we are indoors with where the light is poor and then we go out, or the other way around. So we only need to work with the aperture and shutter speed and don't worry about the ISO because it will be automatic, okay? So remember that when working with semi-automatic modes, the exposure meter is set at 0. But what if I want to vary the amount of light that goes through the camera? Is it possible to tweak the parameters as we do with manual mode? Yes, it is. How? Well, you'll need to investigate how to do it in your camera. In this one, there's a little button which says AV plus minus, and then after pressing it, the exposure meter is activated. And if we move the dial, it will move to the plus or minus signs. So at this point, we can calibrate again the meter and shoot with an extra point of light, or on the contrary, move the meter to the left and reduce the amount of light, okay? Let's do an exercise to understand much clearer what I just said, although you shall practice this at home as well, okay? So, what we are going to do now is an exercise using the semi-automatic modes. You'll see that they are sometimes very useful when adjusting the camera in certain scenes, okay? So here I have this cute cat moving its hand. The first thing we'd do, if we were working with the manual mode, is to set the ISO, okay? So in this case, we would need to bear in mind that although there's plenty of light in this indoor setting, these cameras always need more light. For this reason, we could set ISO to 1600, and now I'll set the aperture to 5.6 and the speed to 500. This means that when working with manual mode, it's us who have to set the aperture, the speed, and the ISO in order to take a picture. Okay, guys, what else do you need to know? Well, when we take a photo, we need to pay attention to the scene we are shooting. In this case, as you can see, there's movement in the scene. So we can do two different things. We can focus on the blur, and thus work with the depth of field, or pay attention to the movement of the arm. What does interest me the most? If you're one of those photographers who focuses on the depth of field, then you need to select the AV mode, which prioritizes the aperture. Let's see it with two examples. I'm going to use a wide open aperture, the highest value it allows me. The lens is slightly zoomed right now. And remember that the aperture, the size of the hole of light, depends on the focal length. It is the zoom you made. So I zoomed in a little bit to get a close-up photo of the little cat. So the maximum aperture allowed in this case is 5. If I take a photo, there it goes. What do I get? As I'm working with a wide open aperture, I've zoomed in and I'm close to the cat. I'll get a close-up picture of the cat with a blurred background. Let's take another one. Perfect. This is AV mode, with which we've got that blur effect, okay? So this is focused on the blur, but what if I want to focus on the movement? Do I want to capture the arm motionless or moving? Let's say we want it moving, okay? In this case, instead of prioritizing the aperture with the AV mode, we can select the TV mode to give priority to the shutter speed. If you already know how to adjust the parameters, then you should know that the maximum speed to capture motion is around 125 1/60, more or less. Okay, I'm going to use a lower speed than 125. For example, 1/30 to see what happens. As it's a low speed, the camera is adjusted automatically to a really close aperture because I'm letting plenty of light through the camera. So it asks me to close the aperture. Why? Because I previously adjusted ISO to 1600. Now I could even lower ISO since I'm letting in too much light. So such a high ISO isn't necessary. Let's set the speed at 1/30 and ISO at 100. 200 isn't necessary, okay? And then take a picture of the cat trying to capture the movement. It's not a fast movement, but with the speed 1/30, it's possible to appreciate the movement. Let's say I want to reflect even more movement on the image. We need to reduce the speed even more to 1/15. Don't forget that we must use speed that we can handle when taking photos without any support. And also pay attention to the following when playing around with the speed. Here in the lens it has the stabilizer, and then you need to deactivate it, okay? Let's take another picture with the slower speed. See? Now the movement is much clearer since we deactivated the stabilizer and reduced the speed. Guys, we could even select a slower speed, for example to 1/5, okay? And repeat the shot. See? You can hear now the shutter, clack, clack. And now, as we are working without a tripod, we need to be careful. And this is the result. So guys, the parameter we prioritize and the mode we use will depend on the scene we want to shoot. What about the P mode, the Pro mode? It shares features with automatic modes and it works similarly. It depends on the Reprocessing Rule, which means that it adjusts the parameter shutter speed and aperture accordingly. If I rotate the dial, I'll have a wide open aperture with slightly faster speed, and if I rotate it to a smaller aperture, the shutter speed will be slower as well. It's likely to happen that when working in the manual or semi-automatic mode, results aren't as expected, or you're in a hurry and these modes aren't effective enough, then instead of using the automatic mode, which I recommend you ignore it, we could use the program mode, which is similar to the automatic, but it allows us to control some options that we are going to see throughout the following lessons, okay? Anyway, you can practice at home and check the results obtained with each mode. Also, as I was saying, we can also compensate the exposure. How? Let's say that the picture of the cat I just took is a bit dark. I can fix it by overexposing the scene, which means adding more light to it. So I'm going to add a point of light and repeat the photo with an open aperture. Or well, let's rather experiment with the movement instead. So I'm going to set the aperture as it was before, 1/15, and repeat the picture. That's it. Let's see if I manage to capture the movement. Yes. I prefer this picture which is overexposed than the other one which was set at 0. It's something personal, and the amount of light of the scene will depend on your personal taste, so it's you who have to adjust it depending on what you want. Let's take another one. You guys at home take an object and try to take pictures, experimenting with blur and movement, and play around with the different exposure modes to see how they work in each case. So guys, the ideal would be that you become familiar with these modes, not only the automatic, so that you are able to control the parameters regarding your needs, okay? In my case, for instance, I don't work with motion very often, so I frequently use the manual and AV modes. However, there are many photographers who focus on action, so they prefer paying attention to motion and how to control it. So they work with TV modes, okay? That's why I recommend that you practice at home and see which one of these modes fits your needs better and which one you feel more comfortable with. Let's talk now about the different warnings and notifications that are likely to appear when working with parameters not suitable for the light of the scene. For instance, let's go back to the little cat. We've been practicing with it in order to capture motion, but what about taking a motionless shot? Well, in this case, we'll continue working with TV mode, which, remember guys, gives priority to the exposure time, but I'm going to select a faster speed instead at 500, for example. So when I focus on the kitten with the speed of 500 and open aperture and ISO at 100, the aperture number starts blinking. It means that obviously I can take the photo, but the result will be completely underexposed. So every time a parameter starts blinking, what some cameras indicate it's in red, it means that something is wrong, so we need to understand what the camera is trying to tell us. In this case, I've chosen a quite fast speed. What does it mean? That we are letting the light through the camera a little time. So this blinking indicates that the camera needs more light. Perhaps a 500 speed is not necessary for capturing the arm's motion. So we are going to reduce it a little bit. Now the camera tells us that we need to reduce it to 60 approximately. But is motion captured at this speed? Just a little bit. So if we want to capture motion and keep working with a 500 speed, then the only solution would be increasing the ISO, because the aperture can't be open. So let's increase the ISO to 800. And at this value, you'll see that the blinking or any other warning disappears, and that we can get a frozen image. So guys, these semi-automatic modes are cool and great, but we need to be careful and pay attention to any warning, which would mean that you need to readjust the ISO, the aperture or the shutter speed. Otherwise, you won't be able to get a properly exposed picture. Okay, so in some cases, in some occasions, we work indoor and the light is poor. In those cases, we need to try to change the light quality or avoiding working at fast speeds. Just as I did. I adjusted it to a slower speed and the warning disappeared. So guys, give it a try and experiment with the different options. See you in the next video.